The soldiers laughed when she first walked into the base, wearing a plain gray cloak with no badge, no weapon, no helmet, and no rank on her collar. Her boots were dusty, her hands were small, and her face looked too young for war. But there was something strange about her eyes. They were calm, too calm, for a place like this. She stood at the edge of the camp near the gate as trucks rolled in covered in dirt, and oil smoke filled the air, and shouts echoed from the barracks. No one noticed her at first until General Hart stepped out of command and walked straight toward her. Without a word he nodded, and she nodded back, then he motioned for her to follow. That's when people started whispering. Who is she? Why did the general greet her with respect? Why didn't she salute? Why didn't he question her name? She followed him into the war room. While officers looked confused and a little nervous, she said nothing and took no seat. She stood near the corner silent, like a shadow, while maps and battle plans were laid out. When the meeting ended, the general walked out, and she stayed behind, just staring at the map. For hours no one dared speak to her. Some joked that she was the general's niece. Others said she was some kind of secret weapon sent by command, or maybe a spy from the upper colonies, but no one knew for sure. That night a squad returned late from a recon mission, covered in blood and fear. They said something was moving out there in the forest, something fast and silent like a machine, but alive. The general ordered a lockdown, and all soldiers prepared for a night attack. Snipers climbed the towers, drones hovered above trenches, and everyone held their breath waiting for the signal. Then the girl stepped outside. No one told her to. She just walked out into the middle of the open field, standing in the moonlight with her hands by her sides. Her cloak blew softly in the wind. The soldiers whispered, "What is she doing? Get her back." But the general raised one hand and said, "Wait." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and whispered one word. The sound was quiet, too soft to hear clearly, but every soldier in the trenches, every sniper on the towers, every drone pilot in the bunker heard it inside their head. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Move. And they moved. Every unit shifted like gears in a machine. Every position changed, every barrel turned, every motion timed like they had rehearsed it 1,000 times. But they had not. There had been no orders, no briefings, no drills for this moment. But they moved anyway, because the word she spoke was not just a word, it was a command that felt like instinct, something older than fear. Nothing came from the forest. That night nothing attacked. But when the sun rose, the scouts found footprints all around the base, huge clawed prints and signs of watching eyes. The enemy had come, but never attacked. The general stood on the tower, looking down at the girl, who now sat alone near the fuel tanks, staring at the sky. He asked nothing, and she said nothing. She didn't smile, she didn't blink, she just waited. The next day the soldiers watched her more closely. They stopped laughing, they stopped guessing, they stopped calling her names. No one asked questions anymore. They just watched and waited for the moment she might speak again. One brave sergeant tried to talk to her. He brought her water and said his name. She nodded once, but said nothing. He asked what she whispered the night before. She looked at him and tilted her head slightly, then turned away. Later that day drills began again, and the units trained hard, but now they moved differently, faster, smoother, almost as if their bodies remembered what their minds could not. They moved like they had been trained by something deeper than orders. They called her the girl with no rank, not because she lacked one, but because she didn't need one. She did not command with medals or stripes. She did not shout or threaten. She did not demand anything at all. But when she whispered that word, they obeyed. And deep down, every soldier knew they would do it again, without question, without reason, without fear. Because that whisper was not just a sound. It was power. And the war was far from over. But now they had her, the girl with no rank. And nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning the camp was quiet, the usual shouting, the usual barking of orders, the usual cursing between squads had stopped. The air felt heavy, not with fear, but with something else, something no one wanted to say out loud, and all eyes kept drifting to the same place, to the same person, the girl with no rank. She was sitting near the drone station, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes calm as ever, like she was waiting for something, or maybe watching something others could not see. A bird landed near her, then flew away, like it had been called, then released. No one knew her name, not even the officers. They checked the logs, checked the transfer lists, checked the DNA logs, and there was nothing. She was not registered, not scanned, not cleared, yet the general treated her like a top-level asset, and no one questioned him, because since her arrival things had changed. Scouts who used to go missing in the woods returned safely. Patrols that once got ambushed started bringing back enemy tech. No one knew how, but it was always the same pattern. She whispered the word, and then something shifted. Some said it was luck, others said it was fear, maybe even magic. But those who stood near her said it felt different. It felt like gravity pulling them into action, like a voice inside their chest, not their ears, telling them to move. And they did, without thinking, without doubt. On the third day the storm came. Black clouds rolled over the valley faster than the weather team could report. By the time the warning came, the first drops had already fallen hard, sharp, like metal slicing down from the sky. Soldiers ran for cover, guards covered the drones, and gunners locked into the towers. But the storm was just the beginning. A signal burst through the comms, static, sharp, then clear. Enemy movement coming from the ridge, 30 hostiles, maybe more. Fast and heavy. Someone yelled out the code red: alert, scramble, all units. But the speakers glitched and went silent. Panic hit the bunker. The communication lines were jammed, the radar blinded by the storm. The general reached for the emergency switch, but before he could pull it, someone opened the door slowly, calmly. It was her. She walked inside, dripping wet, her cloak sticking to her skin, her eyes locked on the red dots flashing on the screen. She walked past the general, past the command table, and stood in the center of the room. No one stopped her, no one dared. The operators backed away, without knowing why. The officers held their breath, without realizing it, and the general stepped aside, without a word. She placed one hand on the table and closed her eyes. Then she whispered, "Move." And once again, they moved. Not in confusion, not in fear, but in perfect motion. Soldiers ran to the walls, picked up weapons, jumped into formation, like pieces of a puzzle fitting into place, even though no one gave them orders, even though the comms were still dead. Outside, the wind howled and the rain burned like acid, but they held the line and fired with precision, as if they knew exactly where the enemy would be, and they did not miss, not once. By the time the storm cleared, the bodies lay in a circle around the camp. None had breached the wall, not a single soldier was lost, and the only person who had not fired a shot was her. She stood at the edge of the camp, her hair blowing gently, now her eyes still watching something in the distance, maybe the last cloud, maybe something else. Later that night, while everyone rested, a small boy from the kitchen team walked up to her. He was maybe 10, maybe younger. His voice shook as he asked, "Are you a witch, or a robot, or something else?" She looked at him for a long moment, then knelt down and whispered, "Just a girl." The boy ran off wide-eyed, but smiling, and the soldiers nearby just stared in silence. Not one dared laugh, not one dared question. In the days that followed, stories spread beyond the camp. Other units began to hear rumors of the girl who could command with a whisper. Entire squads requested transfers to be near her. Some called her a miracle, others a ghost. But those who saw her knew better. She was not loud, not proud, not decorated with medals. She never smiled, never saluted, never raised her hand in anger. But when she whispered one word, the army moved, and no one dared disobey. Not anymore. Not ever again. They sent a new commander to the camp, a man named Colonel, dressed tall, loud, proud, with shiny medals on his chest, and a voice like thunder. He walked through the base, with heavy boots barking orders. Before even learning the names of the squads, he laughed when he saw the girl with no rank sitting by the fuel station, her cloak torn, her boots old, her eyes calm. "What is that supposed to be?" he said to the general. "A mascot, or some more pet? Why is she even here?" The general did not answer. He just looked at the colonel and said, "She stays, that's all." Colonel Dress scoffed and walked away, shaking his head. The next day, he held a meeting in the war room. He shouted at lieutenants. He scolded the drone pilots. He even slammed a folder on the table and demanded discipline in front of everyone. Then he turned to the girl, who stood silently near the wall like always. He pointed at her and said, "You don't even speak. Do you think silence gives you power? Say something now, or leave this base." She did not move, she did not blink, she just stared at the table. The room went quiet. The general stood still. The officers looked down, and no one dared breathe, but still she said nothing, not a single word. Colonel Dresk laughed and stormed out of the room. He called her useless in front of the guards. He said she was a joke. He said war needed real leaders, not silent children playing at being wise. That night something strange happened. At 0200 hours the alarms went off, but not the usual ones. The red emergency beacons lit up all across the base, but no one could find the source. The scanners picked up no movement, no heat, no signals, but the systems were flashing warning after warning. Colonel Dresk rushed to the tower, yelling for answers. His elite squad had been posted on the east side near the cliffs. He demanded a report from them, but there was only silence. The general sent a recon team. They found nothing, just empty tents and scattered gear, no signs of a fight, no blood, no noise, just the mark of boots leading away into the trees like they had walked off in perfect order. Gone, without a trace. The next morning the colonel was pale, his voice hoarse. He did not yell anymore, he did not command the same way. When he walked past the girl, he looked away, his boots softer now, like he did not want to be heard. No one spoke of what had happened, but everyone knew. She had not moved that night, she had not whispered. She had only stood near the tower for a moment, eyes open, hair lifted by the wind, and then walked away. Soldiers began watching her differently, not with curiosity, but with caution, not like she was one of them, but something else, something older, something made of war, but not born from it. She became the silent center of the camp. When she walked, the guard straightened. When she stood still, the wind itself seemed to stop. Even the birds flew quiet around her. One private said he saw her talking to a shadow behind the water tanks. But when he looked again, nothing was there. Another said her reflection moved before she did, like the mirror was waiting for her to catch up. Still she never raised her voice. Still she never asked for power. But when something went wrong, when the radios failed, when the officers panicked, when the sensors went dark, they all turned to her without being told. And she would whisper. And they would move. Without doubt, without delay, without fear. It was not just the soldiers now, it was the machines too. The drones flew better. When she watched, the scanners blinked smoother. The gates opened faster. Even the old medical bots responded to her presence. They started calling her names behind her back, not to insult, but out of awe. The whisperer, the ghost sergeant, the commandless, one, the colonel of silence. But she never reacted. She just walked where she was needed. And when she whispered, things changed. The general kept her name off the reports. The higher command asked questions, but he gave no answers. And no one pushed harder, because results were results. And since she came back, the casualty rate had dropped, the mission success rate had climbed, and the soldiers stopped breaking down from fear. They still remembered that first word she spoke, move. And they remembered how it felt, like it had come from inside them, like they had always known it, like they were just waiting for someone to say it. Now they waited again, waited for her to whisper, because her silence was no longer empty. It was command. And no one wanted to be the one who ignored it again. The sky was dark with smoke and ash before the battle even started. The soldiers stood along the wall, their rifles loaded, their hearts beating fast. They had seen war before, but this felt different. The enemy had gathered in numbers too large to count, machines, monsters, and men all marching. As one, the air shook with their approach, and even the ground seemed to fear them. The scouts returned with pale faces, their voices shaking. They said the enemy had new tech, invisible armor, silent drones, creatures that fed on light. They said they were coming fast, and they were not going to stop. Inside the war room, the general gathered every officer, every squad leader, even Colonel Dresk, who now spoke in whispers, not shouts. They all looked to the same corner, where she stood still and quiet as always, the girl with no rank. She had not spoken in 3 days, she had not whispered a single word, but now as the maps lit up with red lights and the alarms rang over and over, they all waited for her to move, for her to whisper, for her to lead. But she did not. Not yet. The enemy reached the outer hills, their banners burning, their machines screaming, and still she stood still. The soldiers looked at one another, afraid not of the enemy, but of what it meant that she had not acted yet. Then, without warning, she stepped outside. She walked up the center path, her cloak dragging behind her, her boots silent on the dust, her face calm like the storm had no meaning to her. The gates opened without command, and she walked through alone. The enemy saw her. They paused for a breath, confused by the single figure standing between them and the base. Some laughed, others aimed their weapons, but none fired, not yet. The soldiers watched from the walls, not moving, not breathing. As she raised her head and looked at the sky, the clouds shifted, as if afraid to cover her. The air grew heavy, then still. Then she spoke. 2 words. The sound was soft but clear, louder than before, but still not shouted, yet it rolled through the air like a wave through water, and every soldier, every drone, every machine on their side heard it, not just with ears, but inside their blood. Fall now. And they did. The drones fell from the sky, But not broken, they moved like blades cutting through the enemy air units. The tanks that had failed to move for weeks surged forward and fired with perfect aim. The soldiers on the wall leapt into motion faster than they had ever trained, like their muscles had been waiting for that command. The enemy fired back, but their bullets curved off course. Their mechs stumbled, their creatures howled, and scattered. The red tide of their army began to crack, not because of fear, not because of confusion, but because something unseen pushed against them, something in the air, something inside them. She stood still, her hands at her sides, her eyes glowing with something no one could name, and the battlefield bent around her shape, not touching her, not daring to. By the time the sun reached the middle of the sky, the enemy had broken half their force, destroyed the rest, fleeing into the woods, leaving behind weapons, screams, and silence. The soldiers cheered, but no one ran to her, no one dared. She turned slowly, walked back toward the gate, the wind quiet around her, her face still calm, but her eyes holding something deep, something old, something endless. The general met her at the gate. He did not speak, he did not salute, he only nodded and stepped aside. She entered the camp again, not as a girl, not as a mystery, but as something more, something that spoke only when the world needed to change. Later that night, no one slept. The men cleaned their weapons in silence. The officers stared at the maps, unsure how to explain the victory, and the engineers checked the machines for damage, but found nothing, only perfect execution. The medics reported 0 deaths, not a single life lost on their side during the battle, not one. The soldiers gathered in the mess hall, where food was untouched, where laughter had vanished. And they spoke of the 2 words she had spoken. They wrote them down, carved them into their knives, into their helmets, into their hearts. Fall now. They did not understand what it meant. They did not need to. They had followed, and they had survived. And now they waited for the next word, because she had spoken twice. And the war was not yet done. The enemy commander was proud of his machines, proud of his beasts, proud of the line of steel and fire that stretched across the mountains. He had watched many battles, and lost very few. He believed fear was enough to win wars, and for a time it was. He had heard of the girl with no rank, had laughed at the reports, had mocked the silence and the whispers, and the way a whole army moved at her soft voice. He called her a trick, a ghost story, something humans made up to give their soldiers hope in the dark. So he sent a message. He stood before a camera in full armor, surrounded by his army, and said, I challenge her. If she is real, if she has the power they claim, let her come here alone, or I will burn the camp to the ground. He smiled with sharp teeth and raised his weapon in the air. He said, come and face me, little girl, or hide behind your general like a scared child. The message reached the human camp at sunrise. Officers gathered quickly around the screen, eyes wide, breath tight. The general frowned, the soldiers cursed. But no one spoke. Louder than a whisper, all eyes turned to the corner, where she sat alone, as always, the girl with no rank. She stood before anyone could speak, and walked forward without a word. She passed the general, past the guards, past the gate. Before the orders were given, she walked into enemy land, with only her cloak and calm breath. The enemy commander waited at the hilltop, his men around him, armed with weapons that hummed and burned and clicked. They saw her approaching, small, quiet, alone, and they laughed. He stepped forward and said, you really came. I must say, I am impressed, or maybe just curious. What happens now, little ghost? Will you speak and make my army vanish, or will you die like the rest? She said nothing at first, just looked around at the thousands of faces, weapons, raised eyes full of fire. Then she walked closer until she stood right in front of him, their helmets almost touching, and whispered one word. Only one. His face changed, his eyes widened, his mouth opened, but no sound came. His hands began to shake, and the weapon he held dropped to the ground with a dull thud. The laughter around them stopped. The soldiers shifted, but did not understand. He stepped back, breathing hard, staring at her like she was not real. Then, without warning, he reached for his sidearm, aimed it at his own head, and pulled the trigger. Silence followed. Not just in the crowd, not just on the hill, but across the whole valley. Like the air itself had frozen. Even the beasts backed away. Even the machines shut down for a moment, as if stunned by something they could not calculate. She turned and walked back down the hill, slowly, calmly, without fear. The enemy soldiers stood frozen, their commander gone, his last breath still echoing in their minds, and the word she spoke still ringing in their bones. The humans watched from a distance, stunned, as the enemy began to drop their weapons, one by one, not from orders, not from fear, but from something else, something inside them that had shifted, cracked, opened, by one word. The general met her at the gate this time with eyes full of something like awe. He said nothing, just stepped aside again and let her pass. In the hours that followed, entire enemy squads surrendered not because they were beaten, but because they no longer wished to fight. They knelt on the ground, hands raised, heads lowered, saying nothing, just waiting for her to look their way. Back in the camp, the soldiers tried to guess the word she had spoken. Some thought it was surrender, others guessed fear. One man said it might have been truth or guilt or remember. But none of them knew, and she never told. What they did know was this: she had spoken only one word, and it broke the enemy without a single shot. Now her silence was heavier than any weapon, and the war was changing fast. Because she was not just a whisper. She was the end of every shout. And they all knew. When she spoke again, the world would bend to listen. The war was over, or so they said. The last enemy stronghold had fallen without a fight. Their armies disbanded, their weapons dropped, and their war machines powered down across the stars and planets where battles had burned for years. Peace began to settle like soft dust on old scars, but no one cheered too loudly because the girl with no rank had not spoken again. She sat near the edge of the camp, looking out at the silent fields where once fire and metal ruled. Her cloak still gray, her boots still worn, her voice quiet. As always, the soldiers gave her space, not out of fear, but out of respect. They remembered every word she had spoken and how the world had changed each time. The general received calls from high command. They wanted to see her, wanted to reward her, wanted to record her name in the halls of honor. But the general said no every time. He said, she is not a tool, she is not a symbol, she is not yours to summon. Still the messages kept coming. They begged for one last word, one last command to shape the future, to build the peace she had won with whispers instead of fire. But she said nothing. Not yet. One night, as the stars burned bright above the camp, she stood and walked slowly through the base. The soldiers followed, not with words, not with noise, just quiet steps behind her, some holding their breath, some holding tears. They knew it was time. She moved past the barracks, past the towers, past the place where she had first whispered move, and stopped at the old parade ground, now cracked and half covered in weeds. She stepped into the center and turned around, her eyes meeting every face. The general stood near the front. No orders, no salute, just watching like the others, waiting for something, not knowing what. She raised one hand, placed it over her chest, and whispered one final word. Gone. The wind blew hard, then soft, then still. Her cloak lifted, and then fell again. And when the wind stopped, she was no longer there. No one had seen her move, no one had seen her vanish. She was simply not there. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Someone stepped forward to check the ground, but there were no footprints, no heat, no trace, not even dust on the boots left behind. They searched the base, they searched the valley, they sent drones far beyond the hills, but she was not found, not by scanner, not by sensor, not by sight. She had left, just as quietly as she had come. And though the camp returned to normal in the days ahead, it was never the same. Her absence was not silence. It was a space filled with memory, with power, with a question no one could answer. Some believed she was human, a gifted child with a power too strange to explain. Some believed she was not human at all, but something older, something born from the war itself. Others believed she was a spirit, a voice from the future, sent to guide them back to peace. But none of that mattered. What mattered was this. She had whispered one word, and they had moved. She had whispered two, and they had survived. She had whispered again, and the enemy had broken, and now her final word hung in the air like a soft echo in the heart of every soldier. Gone. Not lost, not defeated, not forgotten, just gone. And yet, when danger returned years later on distant worlds, when darkness crept through cracks in the peace, some soldiers heard a voice inside their minds, not loud, not shouted, just soft and steady, and they moved without thinking, just like before. Some say she still walks in the smoke between stars, whispering to those who listen, guiding those who lead, and reminding all who remember that sometimes one word is enough to change everything. The girl with no rank left no statue, left no name, left no badge. But she left something far greater. A legacy wrapped in silence. A command buried in the hearts of thousands. And a whisper that never fades. Even when she is gone,